Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
Well, so Biden, again, promised about 80% or a little more than 80% of the total promises from this summit. And what that translates into is a reduction in temperature by the end of the century if Biden actually makes the next president or the next after that in 2030 carry through his promises, and if all the presidents for the next 70 years up till 2100 do the same. If all that happens, he will have managed to reduce global temperatures by the end of the century by 0.04 degrees centigrade. This is if you run it in the standard UN climate model. So very, very little impact. Now, remember, Biden is talking about, as you also saw with Kerry, that this will cost about $500 billion a year. That's $1,500 per person in the U.S. per year. The average person in the U.S. says they're not even willing to pay $24. There is a potential divergence here. You're not going to be able to see support for that kind of policy in the long run.
That's Bjorn Lomborg. What an outstanding thinker. He's an author. He calls himself the skeptical environmentalist because he actually has environmental goals in his heart, but he sees through the BS of politicians, bureaucrats, global warmists. The left hates him because he's not a climate denier, as they call many conservatives. He's someone who's worried about the climate and the environment, but he just says, your carbon tax is not going to work. This $500 billion a year spending proposed by Joe Biden is not going to work. But that certainly won't stop Western politicians from digging in. Look at this Zoom meeting with the world's leaders. Joe Biden, the only one wearing a mask. I found that a little bit odd. He's on the right-hand side there. They weren't meeting in person, so he couldn't catch a cold through his computer. By the way, he's already been vaccinated. Maybe he's heard about one of those computer viruses. I don't know. I just thought it projected a weirdness or a lack of science or just a general weakness. Compare him to, well, there's China's Xi Jinping on the left. In the middle, there's Vladimir Putin. Even our own Justin Trudeau took off the mask. Listen, he knows about mugging for the cameras. He didn't need to be told twice. But Joe Biden wearing a mask as he accepts a $500 billion a year charge on the U.S. economy. Joining me now via Skype from the Washington, D.C. area is our friend Marc Morano, the boss of ClimateDepot.com. Marc, it's hard to believe that during the pandemic, the lockdowns, the economic disruption of the last 14 months, that anyone would seriously be talking about spending $500 billion a year in the United States to fight global warming, a fight that, as Bjorn Lomborg points out, has no possibility of success by its own terms, and that China is just laughing at because they're not going to do anything.
Yes, and you're right. It makes no sense, but that's exactly where we are. And interestingly enough, you have to understand what the Biden administration is doing. Every cabinet agency is a climate agency. All the executive orders are a way to implement a stealth Green New Deal. Every funding decision, the transportation bill, 5% bridges and roads, the rest, all of the woke climate, other types of agendas just thrown in. They are trying to implement the Green New Deal without a legislation, without a vote of Congress, because they learned the last time. It was an embarrassment 2 years ago. 10 years ago, it was an embarrassment when they tried to get the cap and trade carbon style taxes through. They couldn't even get it through a Democratic House and Senate. They got it through the House and it stalled in the Senate. So they're doing all this through executive order. But what's amazing is they know the negative impacts it's going to have. They know it's going to hurt poor and the minorities the hardest because they're going to raise the cost of energy. But you know why they don't care? Because it's designed to do that. Because then they get to reach out and have all the subsidies and universal basic income, and they get to help them. They get more voters for life. So I think we have to look at this. This is an interesting perspective, Ezra, because they know this is going to have devastating effects on the very people they claim to be helping, but they don't care because those effects will justify more government intervention, which is part of the progressive plan. Create a bigger disaster, which requires even more government, which then gives you more power, more guaranteed elections, and they're right on path to do what their goal is.
Yeah,
climate.
You know what? It's shocking to hear it phrased that way, but I think it's true. I mean, one of the first things that Joe Biden did was to halt the Keystone XL pipeline. That pipeline is actually already built across the border from Canada to the United States. That's almost a year ago now that was built, but it was not finished. And so he just sees that, frees that. Thousands of unionized steel workers, welders, etc., out of work, and he doesn't care. You know, how many millions of people work in fracking all around America? That's the solution, but he would rather have those people retraining to learn how to code or whatever the theory is. He would rather have them helpless than earning six figures doing oil, gas, coal, fracking, whatever. It's shocking, but I think you're right on that.
And that's exactly the labor leader, Terrence O'Sullivan, head of the Laborers International Union, LIUNA, who was a part of all these pipelines and the Keystone. He came out and called it, BS, that the workers could be retrained. They don't really care, because in their end goal of all this is to give them make work government jobs based on solar and wind panel subsidies. And that's the only way that they can survive. Some of the stats are hundreds of workers in a solar or wind power environment to equal one worker from a fossil fuel plant. Mm-hmm. Some others are 67, workers to equal one worker. So they're going to create a lot of jobs in solar and wind, but they're all going to be dependent on government mandates, direct subsidies, massive spending, and they're going to have short timelines and they have to be renewed. But they don't care, because the more they get the public dependent on their actions and more income. And that's why they love lockdowns, endless lockdowns, bankrupts the economy. And it does one very important thing: get rid of the small businesses, the mom and pops, because they can't control them with this sort of great reset agenda. They can't get them to comply with mask mandates or lockdowns or vaccine passports. And the same thing is true. So with the climate agenda and with the virus agenda, they can just crush everything down and then build back better, i.e., in the socialist universal basic income, all-powerful government model. And that's why climate is happening. To go back to your opening question, Ezra, climate and the virus are working hand in hand. The agenda behind those two to scare us is working hand in hand to crush society as we've known it as a free market system. And they are working overtime for that.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.